Hi, it's William Lee. I'm back with the 8th installment of our Thomas Mann novel, Magic Mountain, a series on life in Davos and at a Davos sanatorium, TB sanatorium, side by side with looking at the Magic Mountain and how that life is described there and what the reality was. So, as you know, if you've watched any of the previous, I am at an old TB sanatorium that is now a hotel, Schatzalp, and Thomas Mann and his wife were not here. They were at the sanatorium that was lower down. This one is quite high up on the mountainside, called the Wald Sanatorium, and in the novel it's called the Berghof. And Schatzalp was even more international, even more luxurious, and it's the only sanatorium that Thomas Mann actually mentions by its real name in the novel. But here I am on the stairs, so that's the second floor behind me that you can see, and when I turn around you will see the landing between the second and third floors. So here we go. Here's the third floor up here, and Dmitri's room is right behind the lift. But what I want to show you today is not Dmitri's room, Grand Duke Dmitri, I should say, who was a patient here from 1939 to 1942, and whose life we are comparing to Hans Castorp's in the novel. So what I want to show you today is this cool little door that's on the landing, the staircase landing between the second and third floors. And where does it go? Good question. You have this beautiful original door handle that some people say is supposed to be a snake's head. It looks like there's a little eye there. And the snake, of course, is traditionally, among other things, a symbol of healing. So it could be that this was a snake's head. I don't know. It's very stylized. And I'm now going to open the door and we will see where this goes. Wow, the weather. We had a marvelous thunderstorm last night. And I was going to record this outdoors, but that is just not going to be possible today. So this is a little bridge. There goes the door. And the bridge goes from this second, third floor staircase landing right outside to the back of the hotel. And if you can see pretty far in the distance, I guess, you see a rock wall and a slope going up, and there's a line of benches. And this was the little path that the patients who were prescribed exercise would go out for their daily walks. All right, so now we're back in the hotel. The pity I couldn't just walk up that with you. We're going to the first floor where I have my things. Let's see, I shouldn't have the camera on me the whole time. Here we go, we're on the first floor. We're going down the corridor. This is the middle section of the hotel heading toward the medical wing, but here's the medical wing. But we're not going there, we're going into this adorable little alcove, which is where I have my things, and I'm going to sit down and we'll talk about what's going on in the latest sub-chapter of the novel, which is entitled Teasing Viaticum Interrupted Merriment. And viaticum, if I'm not mistaken, not being Roman Catholic, is the last rites. in the Latin word for the last rites. So, the reason I started with that little excursion outside to the bridge with the Snake's Head door going across to the exercise area is because immediately after breakfast on his first day in the sanatorium, Castorp goes out with Joachim, who has a prescribed daily walk, and they go, any sanatorium that had the room for it would have had one of these exercise areas for the patients. Oh, I'm actually getting hot now. So this is the description of the one at the Wald Hotel, where the Mans stayed. The Mans. Okay, and I quote from the Woods translation. The main door was on the southeast side of the large white building, and then going a little further, leaving the building by this exit, you did not approach the garden, but came out facing directly onto an open slope of mountain and several low mountain, open slope of mountain meadows dotted with a few tallish firs and several low mountain pines. And the path the cousin took led them gently up the rise to their left, past the rear of the sanatorium, and held it to that direction for a good distance, then made a sharp hairpin to the right and began a steeper ascent up the sparsely wooded hill. So you can see that it's very similar to what we were just looking at. At Schatzalp, it was also behind the hotel. It was also on an upward slope, and with trees, thicker forest certainly than down where Wald Hotel is, even though Wald Hotel means the forest, or Wald Sanatorium means the forest sanatorium. And in the summer, lots of wildflowers, and it's really beautiful. And the whole path is lined with benches, so that if you run out of breath, you can sit down. Okay, so Schatzalp has a really extensive network of beautiful walks and hiking paths, being so high up on the mountain. There's the Eichhornli Weg, and the Thomas Mann Weg, named after the author, of course. And those are both paths that you can take to go from Schatzalp down to town, down to Davos. And there's also upward paths going up to the Strela Pass, which is breathtaking. So many options for beautiful hikes. And unlike in the movie The Shining, which Schatzalp is sometimes compared to, even in deep snow, even in the heart of winter, you can leave Schatzalp on foot. You don't even need the funicular, and get down to town within 20 to 30 minutes, depending on how fast you want to go. So that is not an issue. You can also sled down in the winter, which is great fun. So this was something that in Dmitri's day at Schatzalp was still a part of the treatment. If you were up and about, then you were expected to go out and take these short walks. And he, in some of his letters, would say, well, I'm being driven out. I'm being driven outside. But he seemed to say that as, in a humorous way. It didn't seem to irritate him to have to go outside and take walks. I think he actually liked doing that. So in Hans Castorp's case, we now turn from the subject of the walk itself to the patients he encounters and what he learns about them. So this little throng that he encounters of patients who are also out on their daily walk is, Joachim says they're called the Half-Lung Club. And what they have in common is it's both genders, and it's people who are young and people who are middle-aged, but what they have in common is that they all have had an operation called an artificial pneumothorax. So this was, so we're talking about 1907 here. So this was a form of treatment fairly early on that you could have in addition to the rest cure. So the pure rest cure wasn't your only option. So TB can cause cavities in the lungs. It will eat out a section of lung and there will be a cavity there, that like there would be in a tooth. And those are very dangerous. They're full of bacilli that can spread elsewhere, and they get bigger. And so one of the most important forms of treatment at that time was to get those closed up. And one thing they didn't do at that time was to take out whole lungs or parts of lungs. That was extremely rare, even in the 1940s, because it had such a high mortality rate and people would just die on the operating table. So pneumothorax you could do with a local anesthesia without having to be put under. And what they would do is they'd make an incision between ribs, and then they'd guide a big needle in there, and they would find an opening between the two parts of the lining of the lungs, the pleurae, and then they would fill that space with something, usually with a mixture of air, nitrogen, some kind of gas, but occasionally also with an oil, and that was called an oleothorax. And there were even other things that they tried to use, but I don't know enough about that to get into it. So people can have what's called a spontaneous pneumothorax, where a lung just spontaneously collapses, and that's not a good thing. That, I'm told, is very painful and alarming, and the lung needs to be re-inflated. So what the pneumothorax does, though, is it separates the lung from the chest wall, and it fills that space with something that won't allow the lung to expand, and so it's permanently or temporarily shut down. It's not getting air anymore. It's not, and the idea is that the cavity will close up. And it's possible then later that the lung will be reinflated. It's also possible that it will be permanent. And you actually could do it in both lungs, I believe, if you did a partial collapse. And TB was usually up at the top of the lungs, at the apex of the lungs. So you would need, in that case, to do a pretty substantial collapse. So the problem was that it was often, very often, unsuccessful. It wasn't really a high-risk operation, especially not later. This was pretty early on. But there are, in the diseased lung, sometimes there would be adhesions, so the flesh growing together and actually being stuck to the pleurae. And so you couldn't collapse the lung because it was held to the chest wall, basically. And so in that case, you would have to have a more extensive operation to try and cut those adhesions. And sometimes that worked and sometimes it didn't. And then the next step would be to remove ribs, or to crush the phrenic nerve and paralyze part of the diaphragm. So those were two other methods of trying to get a real lung collapse. So in Dmitri's case, from the time he entered Schatzalp, he was just hoping and praying that he wouldn't end up having to have a pneumothorax, because he equated it with lifetime invalidism. He'd been a very athletic fellow, very active fellow, and he didn't want to be an invalid for the rest of his life. And so what did it really cause invalidism? I mean, a person can breathe and function with just one lung. That's not a problem. But the thing is, if you had a pneumothorax, you had to then be living close to a medical facility where you could go as an outpatient and have it refilled, because whatever substance it was that they put in there, especially gas, it would eventually dissipate. and the lung would possibly come down again, and so you would need to be somewhere where that could be dealt with. And in fact, later on, there will be a scene with a patient who decided to go to Zurich on the spur of the moment, and while she was there, her pneumothorax needed to be refilled, and she went to someone who wasn't experienced with doing it, a doctor, and the whole thing ended up disastrously, and it ends up costing her life. But that comes later in the book. So now to talk about the patients themselves. Now, one of them is able to whistle with her pneumothorax. So it sounds like she's whistling, but it's coming out of, Hans thinks it's coming from her stomach, but it's actually her chest. And that very much takes him aback. And it certainly is rather rude. She does it specifically to scare people, and then she and her friends laugh at them when anybody is new there. But Hans takes it in stride, and he sees the humor of it, and so he says to his cousin, he's inquiring about this whole situation to Joachim, and Joachim says, my God, he said, they're so free. I mean, they're young, and time plays no role in their lives, and they may very well die. Why should they go around with long faces? I sometimes think that illness and death aren't really serious matters, and that it's all more like loafing around, and that, strictly speaking, things are serious only down below in real life. So this is a theme and a motif throughout the novel, that the people who live in sanatoriums are free to do whatever they want because they're sick, and people accept that sick people, especially sick people with money, probably not sick people who are poor, but sick people with money have an excuse for never taking life seriously. So very soon thereafter, though, while they're still on their walk, Joachim gives Hans Castor, sort of fills him in on the flip side of that equation, the opposite side of the same coin, and he talks about the one time that he witnessed somebody dying inadvertently. He was walking down a corridor, and he saw an ecclesiastical procession, a procession with the last rites, a priest and some altar boys, and they were going to the room of someone whom he calls the little Huyus girl. So a young woman and her parents have come, and what he tells Hans in gruesome detail is how when she sees the priest and they bring her the last rites, she freaks out, and she screams, and she thrashes, and she struggles, and she's fighting with every last ounce of strength she has. Even though she was moribund, just lying there in bed, when the realization finally comes to her that she's about to die, she has this almost grotesque reaction of every last bit of strength she can muster. And, it could have been that a few weeks earlier, the little Huyus girl was out walking with the Half Lung Club. So that really is two very different portrayals about how people are confronting death in the sanatorium. And on the one hand, it's all fun and games when it's theoretical. But when it's your turn, it's not so fun anymore. So we'll return to the topic of religion later, which is a very interesting side subject within the novel and that I found also in my research about Schatzalp. So the next thing that Joachim talks about is how the staff of the sanatorium deal with death. And they're trying to erect, without hiding anything, they're trying to erect a barrier, sort of a buffer zone between the patients, the living patients, and the death that occurs around them. Not every day, and not as frequently as perhaps you would think, but when somebody does die, the staff try to be as discreet as possible about it. It's one of these situations where they know that the other patients know that death happens and could happen to them, but and the patients know that the staff know that they're well aware, but everybody has sort of erected this taboo about the subject, except when you're with another person that you know well, another patient that you know well, and then you can talk about it, and people do talk about it. And in fact, even though I think the patients in sanatoriums appreciated that level of discretion, and they didn't want to be reminded at every turn when someone passed away, but they certainly heard about it. And, within days or even hours, you would know who had died. And I've read a lot of accounts of life in sanatoriums, mostly public sanatoriums. And in every account I've ever read, there is that morbid undercurrent. And patients don't want to be confronted with it sort of really starkly face to face, but they also are fascinated by it. And sometimes they do want to hear the gory details, and it annoys them a little bit that they don't see what happens, and that the staff are so discreet about removing the bodies. So here at Schatzalp, not uniquely, there's something that is called a Leichengang, and that is a tunnel that goes underneath the building to remove bodies as discreetly as possible. So other sanatoriums had these. It wasn't uncommon at all. But what is not certain, as far as I can tell, is that these tunnels actually were used for removing bodies as opposed to bringing supplies in and out, bringing luggage and trunks in and out. I mean, I suppose you could use them for both, but I've encountered a lot of skepticism here about whether that was actually the case, and not so much on the part of the hotel itself, as on the part of other historians in the area. And this tunnel is still used to this day at Schatzalp, and it's used precisely for the purpose of moving luggage and supplies that are brought up on the funicular into the cellar of the hotel, from which they can be brought up to the dining room or the guest rooms or whatever. So if you come here and you go up on the funicular, your luggage will go through that tunnel and will be brought up to your room. And it may actually be that no bodies ever made that particular trip. Unfortunately, Dmitri does not talk about he doesn't talk about the rumors that were floating around very often. He was keeping mostly to himself. But he did have an experience once, I think I might have mentioned it before, of a person in the room next door to his dying in the same sort of way that the little Huyus girl died. In this case, it was a middle-aged woman from Serbia, and he liked her, and he was, horrified at what was happening, but also the sort of thing that you can't look away from or can't turn a deaf ear to, because he could hear everything that was happening in the next room. And he was interested to hear at what point they would come and remove the body, and it ended up being, I think she died at 6 a.m. He must have either heard them come and get the body or asked somebody, because he's pretty precise about that, if I recall, without having looked up the actual reference in the diaries. So I may have mentioned before that in a time when from September 1939 until about 6 months later, in 1940, he said that 4 people died at Schatzalp, and at that time the census was about 80 patients in residence. So certainly it's not low, but it's also, it's all relative, isn't it? And a couple of times he said, oh, I didn't like this person, but oh, the poor thing. He was always quite sympathetic. One person that he really did like was an Italian count, Count Peccio. And he had this Italian woman, this woman from Sicily, that was a particular friend of his. And he talked about how just a week, the week before, I think, he and Mademoiselle Termini and Count Peccio had been playing cards in Mademoiselle Termini's room and having a great time. And then he was told that what Count Peccio, that it had spread to his throat, from his lungs to his throat, and that it had actually been the throat tuberculosis that had killed him. And that kind of ended up being a crisis for Dmitri, because he immediately experienced a sore throat, pretty severe, and he lost his voice, and that went on for a few weeks, and the doctor completely dismissed it as unimportant. And he did not actually have, or was never diagnosed with, and never had any further symptoms of throat tuberculosis. So, was it psychosomatic? I don't know. But the last thing, which is very curious in this chapter, so the title of the chapter, of course, is divided, teasing / viaticum / interrupted merriment. And the odd thing is that immediately after, Joachim describes this horrific scene with the little Huyus girl, Hans Castorp starts laughing. Before that, he'd been very reverent. He had even chided Joachim about talking about how people who make a fuss when they're dying should be reproached and taken in hand. And Hans Castorp had been offended by that. But then after hearing this truly horrific story, he just starts laughing and laughing and laughing. So that clearly is a nervous reaction. I say clearly, I think so. I think, it's a release of tension. And it reminds me not of Dmitri while he was here, but of Dmitri while he was a child, and when he would have dinner with the Tsar and Tsaritsa and various people in their circle, that he would sometimes have these laughing fits. And I suspect that that's why they stopped allowing him go to regimental dinners. This is when he was 14 years old, because he would have these uncontrollable laughing fits. And in his case, I think, it was the tension of a 14-year-old boy who didn't have parents, who was an orphan, and I'm not a psychologist, but I think in both cases with Dmitri and with Hans Castorp, the only way that can really describe, aside from the fact that they both had a very keen sense of the absurd, is that it was a release of tension, an emotional release. So I'm hoping the weather will improve, because I very much want to do one of these sessions in the garden, and we'll see. So for now, wait, I've forgotten one thing. So I wanted to show you, I can't remember if I did before. I can never quite do this right. This is a young Hungarian woman who was at Schatz. Her first name was Rosie. It's with a ZS or an SC, so I'm not sure how it's pronounced. And she may or may not have died here. She was here with a sister. The sister came and went, but she stayed between, I believe, 1908 or 1909 and then 1913. And suddenly in May 1913, other family members turned up. And after that, her name and their names disappeared from the guest list. So either she recovered sufficiently to leave, and her father, who appears to have been a widower, and her sister came to take her home, or which is also possible she passed away. And I don't know how old she was. She looks like she could be, between 16 and 19 in the 1910 photos. So I very much hope she didn't. I hope she recovered, which was certainly possible. But I have not yet been able to find out. So thank you for watching, and goodbye until next time.